When laughter hid the loneliest truth in Hollywood, laughter was often mistaken for strength. Applause was confused with love. And silence, real silence, was misunderstood as pride. For decades, the world believed it knew Dean Martin and Clint Eastwood. One was painted as the carefree entertainer, the man who smiled through every room he entered. The other was cast as the unbreakable icon, the embodiment of grit, control, and masculine resolve. But behind the camera lights, behind the jokes and the hard stares, both men carried something far heavier than the public ever imagined. The story begins not on a stage, or in front of flashing cameras, but in a quiet moment that no one else noticed. A moment where laughter was used as armor, and mockery became a shield to protect wounds that had never fully healed. In the early days, when fame still felt new and uncertain, their paths crossed in rooms filled with noise. Smoke curled through the air. Conversations overlapped. People laughed loudly, sometimes too loudly, as if trying to prove they belonged there. Dean Martin was always the center of gravity. He had that rare ability to make a room feel lighter the moment he entered it. His jokes were effortless, his charm disarming. People assumed that a man who could make everyone laugh must surely be immune to pain. Clint Eastwood stood differently in those rooms. He did not compete for attention. He observed. He listened more than he spoke. His presence carried weight, not because he demanded it, but because it was simply there. Many mistook his silence for arrogance. Others mistook it for emotional distance. Very few understood that silence was how he survived. Their interactions, at first, were playful, sharp remarks, teasing comments, humor that danced close to the edge but never crossed it. To outsiders, it looked like harmless banter. Two men from different worlds circling each other with wit and sarcasm. But humor, when used repeatedly, can sometimes hide more than it reveals. Dean would joke about Clint being too serious, about his stoic face, about how he looked like a man who never laughed. The room would erupt. Clint would smirk just enough to keep the joke alive, just enough to signal he wasn't offended. But inside, something tightened. Not anger, not resentment. Something quieter, something older. What no one in that room could see was the long road Clint had already walked before he ever became a symbol. Years of struggle, years of being overlooked, years where success felt just out of reach. He had learned early that showing emotion did not earn respect, it invited dismissal. So he built walls, strong ones, walls that allowed him to survive rejection, failure, and the constant pressure to prove himself again and again. Dean, on the other hand, carried a different kind of weight. His laughter was not the absence of pain, it was his response to it. Behind every joke was a deep awareness of loss, of expectations, of the quiet fear that without humor he might disappear. He had learned that people stayed when he made them smile, so he smiled constantly, relentlessly as their careers grew. So did the distance between who they were publicly and who they were privately. Success amplified everything: praise, criticism, and isolation. They were surrounded by people, yet often felt alone. And in that loneliness, misunderstandings quietly took root. The mockery, subtle at first, became sharper over time. Not cruel, but careless. Dean never intended harm. He believed humor connected people. He believed laughter healed. But he did not see how some jokes, repeated often enough, could reopen wounds someone had spent years trying to close. Clint never spoke up. He never corrected the perception. He never explained that strength did not mean invulnerability. He had built a reputation on control, and breaking that image felt more dangerous than enduring discomfort. So he endured. Years passed. Life moved forward. Roles changed. The industry shifted. Fame matured into legacy. And yet, some unspoken moments remained unresolved, small things that never found words, quietly accumulating like weight on the chest. Then came the evening that would change everything. It was not a grand event. No dramatic announcement. Just a gathering meant to honor years of work, years of contribution, years of stories told on screen. The atmosphere was warm, reflective. People spoke about memories, about shared history, about the journey that had shaped them all. Dean had been asked to speak. He stood at the podium, familiar smile in place, eyes scanning the room. Applause greeted him, as expected. He waited for it to settle, then began not with a joke, but with silence. That alone caught people off guard. He looked older than many remembered, not weak or just real. The kind of presence that comes from having lived long enough to understand what truly matters. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. He talked about time, about how quickly it passes, about how laughter can sometimes distract us from conversations we should have had sooner. The room grew quiet. People leaned in. Then he spoke about respect, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that listens, the kind that recognizes strength and restraint. He spoke about a man who had taught him, without ever intending to, what discipline looked like, what commitment looked like, what it meant to keep showing up. Even when the world misunderstood you, everyone knew who he was talking about. Dean turned slightly, his gaze landing on Clint. For a moment, the air felt heavier. He acknowledged the jokes, the teasing, the moments he had brushed off as harmless. He admitted that sometimes laughter had been easier than honesty, easier than saying, "I see you," easier than admitting admiration. His voice wavered not dramatically, but genuinely. He spoke about regret, the kind that paralyzes but the kind that teaches, the kind that forces reflection. He said that strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Clint sat still. No expression, no movement. But inside, something began to shift. Dean's words were not an apology wrapped in spectacle. They were not exaggerated. They were precise, careful, honest, and honesty has a way of reaching places defenses cannot protect, as Dean finished. He did not end with humor. He ended with gratitude. He thanked Clint not for the image the world saw, but for the example he had unknowingly set, for proving that resilience does not need applause to exist, for reminding him, too late perhaps, but still in time, that respect should never be delayed. The room stood in applause, but Clint did not. He remained seated, eyes fixed ahead, breathing slower than usual. Not because he was overwhelmed by emotion, but because something inside him had finally been acknowledged out loud. Something he had never asked for, something he had never expected. And in that moment, the walls he had built did not collapse in chaos. They softened. Just enough no one noticed at first. Not the audience, not the cameras, but those closest could see that something had changed. The unbreakable image had cracked not in weakness, but in humanity. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a truth that had waited years to be spoken. And in the quiet aftermath of applause, as the room slowly returned to noise, one man realized that strength did not mean standing alone forever, and the other realized that laughter, without empathy, is incomplete. Applause can be loud, but it rarely tells the full story. When the room stood to its feet, most people believed the moment had ended. They thought the speech was the climax. They thought the meaning was already delivered. But real turning points do not announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly after the noise fades, as the applause slowly dissolved into conversation. Clint Eastwood remained seated. His hands rested on his knees, fingers relaxed but unmoving. His face gave nothing away. To the world he looked the same, as always, composed, distant. But inside him, something unfamiliar was unfolding. For years, Clint had lived with a rule he never spoke out loud. Endure first. Feel later. It was a rule forged early, shaped by disappointment and reinforced by survival. When doors didn't open, he worked harder. When praise didn't come, he stayed quiet. When people misunderstood him, he let them. That discipline had carried him far, but discipline, when carried too long, can turn into isolation. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, the isolation cracked. Across the room, Dean Martin stepped away from the podium. The familiar grin was gone. In its place was something more restrained, more vulnerable. He had said what he needed to say, but he wasn't sure how it had landed. Words, once spoken, can no longer be controlled. And Dean, a man who had mastered control through humor, now had to sit with uncertainty. People surrounded him, handshakes, compliments, soft laughter, trying to bring the night back to normal. But Dean's eyes kept drifting to one place. Clint had not moved. That worried him. Dean had expected many reactions. A nod, a polite smile, maybe even a private word later. But this stillness felt different. It felt heavy. And for the first time that night, Dean wondered if he had waited too long to speak. Meanwhile, Clint felt something tightening in his chest, not pain, not weakness, but pressure. The kind that comes when years of unspoken moments suddenly ask to be acknowledged. Dean's words had not embarrassed him. They had not exposed him. They had recognized him. And recognition can be more unsettling than criticism, especially for someone who has spent a lifetime. Unseen by choice, Clint stood. The simple act sent a ripple through the nearby crowd. Conversations paused. Eyes followed him, not out of concern, but curiosity. He rarely reacted publicly, rarely responded emotionally. People leaned closer, instinctively sensing that something unscripted was about to happen. Clint didn't walk toward Dean immediately. He took a few slow steps, then stopped, as if reconsidering. As if weighing a decision that had been postponed for decades, his mind drifted backward. 2 nights when doubt was louder than confidence. 2 years when success felt temporary and failure felt permanent. 2 moments when jokes had landed, laughter had followed, and he had told himself it didn't matter. He had told himself that real strength did not need acknowledgement, but standing there now, he realized something uncomfortable. Strength still needs connection. Dean noticed him, then really noticed him. Not the icon, not the image, the man. Their eyes met across the room, and in that brief moment, the years between them seemed to fold inward. Clint crossed the distance. The room grew quiet, not silent, but alert. People sensed they were witnessing something that would not repeat itself. Something fragile. Clint stopped in front of Dean. No microphones, no script. Just 2 men standing in the aftermath of truth. For a long second, neither spoke. Then Clint nodded, not sharply, not dramatically. Just once. "I heard you," he said. The words were calm, steady, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Dean swallowed. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. Clint continued, not with emotion, not with explanation, but with honesty. He spoke about silence. About how it can protect you but also trap you. About how sometimes people mistake restraint for absence. And how easy it is to let misunderstandings grow when no one challenges them. He didn't accuse. He didn't revisit old jokes. He didn't reopen wounds. Instead, said something unexpected. "Most people think being strong means never letting anything get to you," Clint said. "But strength also means knowing when something did get to you, and choosing what to do with it." The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned closer to listen. Clint thanked Dean not just for the words spoken tonight, but for the courage it took to say them at all. He admitted that recognition, when it comes late, still matters. That respect, even delayed, still heals something. Dean's eyes burned not with tears, but with relief, because for the first time, laughter was no longer carrying the weight alone. But the night was not finished with them yet. Later, when the event wound down and the crowd thinned, something happened that no one reported. No cameras captured it. No headlines mentioned it. But it was the most important moment of all. They sat together, away from the noise, away from expectation. Not as legends, not as performers. Just as 2 men who had survived long journeys in different ways, they spoke quietly. About time, about fear, about the cost of always being on, about the loneliness that success can bring when it replaces sincerity with admiration. Clint admitted something he had never said publicly, that there were moments he felt invisible despite being seen by millions. That strength, when never shared, becomes a burden. Dean listened. This time, he did not interrupt with humor. He did not soften the moment with a joke. He let silence do what laughter could not. And in that silence, understanding finally arrived, but understanding, when it comes, often demands change. As they stood to leave, Clint felt lighter but also uncertain. Opening a door, even slightly, means something can walk through it. And he wasn't sure yet what that would be. What he did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that this night would follow him home, that the words spoken would echo long after the lights were turned off, and that the strongest moment of his life was still ahead. Because sometimes, the collapse is not physical. Sometimes it is the moment the walls finally give way. The drive home was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind. The kind that presses against the chest and forces the mind to replay moments it would rather avoid. Clint Eastwood kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, posture unchanged. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen the same man the world had. Always known, controlled, focused, unshaken. But inside, something was unraveling. Dean's words had followed him out of the room. Into the night, into the silence of the car. Not the applause, not the attention. The recognition, that single dangerous thing Clint had trained himself not to need. For decades, he had lived by structure, routine, self-command. Emotion was something handled privately, if at all. He had learned that the world respected results, not vulnerability. So he gave the world what it asked for and kept the rest locked away. Tonight, the lock had loosened as he reached his home. The stillness felt louder than the crowd ever had. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there longer than usual. No calls, no noise, no expectations. Just to manned the echo of words he could no longer dismiss. He poured a glass of water, didn't drink it, set it down untouched. Clint sat. That was when the memories came, not gently, but all at once. Early rejections, long stretches of uncertainty, moments when he had questioned whether endurance was courage or simply habit, times when he had been praised for being unbreakable. Never realizing that the label itself had become a prison, he had told himself that silence was strength, but silence, left alone too long, becomes isolation. Across town, Dean Martin sat awake as well. The night had not brought relief. It had brought reflection. For years, he had used humor to survive, to deflect pain, to connect quickly, to keep conversations light enough that no one looked too closely. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered how many moments he had misunderstood because he chose laughter over listening. He replayed Clint's face when the room went quiet, the stillness, the restraint that looked like indifference to so many, but now, to Dean, looked like discipline stretched too thin. Dean realized something unsettling. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones closest to collapse, not because they are weak, but because they have carried too much alone. Back at home, Clint stood again, pacing slowly. He felt something unfamiliar in his chestnut pain. Not panic. Exposure. The unsettling awareness that something deeply personal had been acknowledged publicly. Respectfully, without demand, he sat down once more. This time, he didn't resist. The collapse that would later be whispered about did not look dramatic. There was no spectacle, no crisis, no visible breakdown. It was internal, quiet, profound, and irreversible. For the first time, Clint allowed himself to feel what he had postponed for years: gratitude, regret, relief, and with them, exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, but the fatigue that comes from always being the strong one. His shoulders lowered slightly. His breathing slowed. His eyes closed, not in surrender, but in release. The walls he had built did not crash down violently. They dissolved, carefully, piece by piece. Enough to let air in? He thought of something Dean had said earlier about laughter delaying honesty. Clint realized that silence had done the same. Both men had been surviving, not connecting ours, passed unnoticed. When Clint finally stood again, something had shifted. He wasn't weaker. He wasn't shaken, but he was changed. Strength no longer felt like something to defend. It felt like something to share. The next morning, rumors would begin not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the world often misunderstands quiet transformation. Someone would say he looked different. Someone else would say he seemed distant. Words like collapse would be used because people didn't know how to describe a man who had finally stopped bracing himself. But the truth was, simpler and far more powerful, he hadn't collapsed. He had let go and letting go. For someone who had held everything together for so long, felt terrifying and freeing. What Clint did not know yet was that this internal shift would ripple outward. That choices he made next, small ones, subtle ones, would redefine how others saw strength. And that Dean, too, would soon face a moment where humor would no longer be enough. Because when honesty enters a lifelong governed by restraint, it does not leave quietly. It demands continuation. By morning, the story had already begun to change. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the world has always been uncomfortable with quiet transformation. People look for spectacle. They look for a visible collapse, obvious weakness, something they can label and explain away. When they don't find it, they invent language to fill the gap. Someone noticed that Clint Eastwood seemed withdrawn in the days that followed. Another noticed he spoke less, listened more. A third said he appeared tired, not physically, but contemplative. Whispers formed. Headlines exaggerated. A simple emotional reckoning was reshaped into something else entirely. The word collapsed surfaced. It spread because it was easier than the truth. The truth required reflection. Clint read none of it. He had learned long ago that public interpretation rarely aligns with private reality. What mattered was not what others thought they saw, but what had changed inside him. He moved differently now. Not slower, not weaker, just lighter. For the first time in years, he allowed pauses in conversation without feeling the need to fill them with control. He let moments breathe. He let people speak fully. He let himself be present without armor. This unsettled some people. When someone has been defined by restraint for decades, any shift feels dramatic to those watching from the outside. But Clint was not unraveling. He was integrating. He was discovering that strength did not diminish when shared, it expanded. Across town, Dean Martin was undergoing a quieter reckoning of his own. For years, Dean had believed kindness was best delivered through laughter. That joy softened truths too sharp to say directly. But after that night, he understood something he had avoided for most of his life. Humor can connect, but it can also hide. Dean began listening differently, not waiting for his turn to speak, not rushing to lighten the moment. He noticed how often people reveal themselves in pauses, not punchlines, and he realized how many opportunities he had missed by filling silence too quickly. He thought often about Clint, not with guilt, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the restraint Clint had shown over the years. Gratitude for the chance to speak honestly before time made it impossible. They did not become inseparable friends. There were no grand public gestures. No interviews explaining what happened. No attempts to correct the narrative, and that was the point. What mattered was not how the world interpreted the moment, but how it reshaped the men who lived it. Weeks later, they met again. Not at an event. Not under lights. Just two men sharing a quiet conversation. There was no need to revisit the past. It had already been understood. Clint spoke once. Simply, most people think strength is about holding everything together, he said. But sometimes it's about knowing what you no longer need to hold. Dean nodded. No joke followed, because some moments don't need decoration. Over time, the rumors faded. New stories replaced old ones. Attention moved on, as it always does. But something lasting had been set in motion, unseen by most and misunderstood by many. The legacy was not a speech, not a headline, not a whispered word. It was an example that resilience does not mean emotional isolation. That kindness must be paired with awareness. That acknowledgement, even late, can still heal. And that the strongest people are often those who finally allow themselves to be human. The world would. Remember Clint Eastwood as a symbol of control? It would remember Dean Martin as a symbol of joy. But behind those symbols lived two men who learned it late. But not to let that strength and softness are not opposites. They are partners. And the moment the world mistook for collapse was, in truth, something far rarer. It was the moment endurance turned into wisdom.